WFSU-FM now presents a delayed broadcast of the June 1st, 2017 luncheon meeting of the Economic Club of Florida. The featured speaker is Stuart Graff, President and CEO of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. This program was recorded at the Florida State University Alumni Center in Tallahassee. And now here's Economic Club of Florida President Marjorie Turnbull.
Steve Evans moved to Tallahassee in 1986 to assume responsibility for IBM's Florida public sector industry and to serve as IBM's senior state executive for its Florida operations. Prior to joining IBM, he was with the St. Louis Cardinals for 6 years. And after a 30-year career with IBM, he, and I put it in quotes, retired, and is deeply engaged in the community, serving on boards, just to name a few, of the Florida Tax Watch, Prime Meridian Bank, and as incoming chair of the Tallahassee Memorial Healthcare Board. In addition, he serves as a mentor for many startup businesses through the Jim Moran Institute. And now, Steve, if you will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. Marjorie, thank you very much. Just a short story on the way to introducing our next speaker. About a year ago, for those of you who know me, you'll appreciate this, that I have zero talent when it comes to architecture. My view of a straight line is about 2 inches, and that's a stretch. But about a year ago, there were a group of us that were getting together for a reunion, and one of them was hosting it out in Scottsdale, Arizona. And he said, for 3 days, we're going to be hosted by the Frank Lloyd Wright Institute. My level of enthusiasm to seeing everybody was great. My level of enthusiasm was spending 3 days at the Frank Lloyd Institute was not. But I'll tell you, 3 days later, I came back passionate, a believer in not just the man, his history, but also the legacy that he's developed, the legacy that he's left this world with, in the buildings that he's designed, the people that he's impacted, the thinking of architecture in a way that nobody else thought about it. And the person who really brought us about this when we were having dinner in Frank Lloyd Wright's living room one night was the gentleman I'll be introducing, Stuart Graff, in just a second. You'll hear Stuart's journey on how he got from where he was. You've read the short bio on the table, where he has an undergraduate degree in engineering. He got his law degree from Loyola in Chicago, and his MBA from Emory University. He spent a couple of decades in corporate life as an intellectual property attorney and fought the battles, fought the good war, but then all of a sudden woke up one day and realized his passion was somewhere else. He'll take you through that journey. By nature, he would view himself as an explorer, having traveled through over 66 countries. He loves history, and he loves food. And he is just a great guy. But he made me a believer in every one of us who were out there a year ago, which is why he's been kind enough to join us here today. So please join me in welcoming Stuart Graff.
Give me a moment here, I'm not as tall. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Economic Club of Florida. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my 66 countries, but this is my first visit to Tallahassee. Took a little walk around, and Steve gave me a little education this morning, and it's just a pleasure to be here. I currently occupy residence in Phoenix. The Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation is based at one of his homes, Taliesin West in Scottsdale, Arizona. So I hang out a lot with tarantulas, coyotes, bobcats. I'm happy that we share something. We share rattlers and rattlesnakes, so go rattlers. You know, what I've been trying to figure out is between Seminoles, eagles, and rattlers, how it is that some gators got into the room, because that's what I understand the landscape around here to be. So I'll be watching on November 25th to see how the gators and the Seminoles sort that out between them. I'm just curious, how many of you are familiar with the work of Frank Lloyd Wright? That's great. He is the only architect that most people in America, and indeed most people in the world, can name spontaneously. How many of you have visited a Frank Lloyd Wright building? Okay, well, most of you, so that's terrific. My guess is that if asked about Frank Lloyd Wright, you'd probably know something about the Prairie School. You've heard of that. You might know something about mistresses, murders, and you certainly have probably heard about leaky roofs, right? We're in the midst of working on on trying to secure a Presidential Medal of Freedom for Frank Lloyd Wright, this being his 150th anniversary year. He has never gotten the recognition from our nation's government, which seems surprising because many others have, including many foreign-born architects, but a man who championed American architecture somehow has not been recognized. So we thought that President Trump, with his concerns about leaks that he can't fix, might have some sympathy for Frank Lloyd Wright. Given that this is the Economic Club of Florida, I'm talking with Marjorie and Steve about the presentation because there's a lot of ground we could cover with Frank Lloyd Wright, a 92-year lifespan, a 70-plus-year career. What we decided to do was to try to focus ourselves on Frank Lloyd Wright and the business community. And as you'll hear in a moment, I'm a brand guy. I've spent my whole professional life focused on brands. My mother likes to say that the first words that I uttered were trademarks because I'd go around reading the sign on every gas station and every shop in the neighborhood. So it seems like a lifelong obsession with brands. And Frank Lloyd Wright did a couple of important things that are relevant to a business conversation. First, he was a very, very powerfully branded individual. So we'll talk about that. The young people in the room will know that all of their career counselors are talking about creating your own brand. Are you guys hearing that? Create your own brand. So Frank Lloyd Wright was doing that 70, 80 years ago, and we'll talk about that. But we'll also talk about how he understood brands, how he had a very, really prescient view of branding. He was well ahead of his time, and how he helped business people build their brands through his architecture. So hopefully this won't bore you. We've got about 20, 30 minutes. I want to thank the tech staff. We were having some IT problems, and no one just wants to hear somebody prattle on about Frank Lloyd Wright without showing some pictures. So we've got a screen up at the end of the room, and I won't mind if you're not looking at me, because there's better things to see. Let's see if we can make this go. Okay, so Steve mentioned a little bit about my background here, and it asked me to talk about this. So I, as mentioned, well, actually, let me back up before what's on this slide. I first discovered Frank Lloyd Wright as an 8-year-old boy. I was educated in an unusual program in the Chicago public schools, programs that I wish we could afford with our school systems today. I wasn't a conventional learner in the classroom. I was that kid who was always making trouble because he was bored in the regular classroom. And so they had a place for us, which was not detention. It was a program where we would spend our time going out to museums, going to national laboratories, going to hospitals, going to all kinds of places, and being inspired by those places to undertake projects from which we would learn. And then we'd go off and do our research, and a lot of it was self-guided learning, but much of that learning began in museums. I have a very strong belief that museums exist to change minds. If they're not doing that, then they shouldn't be around. They're a very expensive pastime if all they are is a way to kill a couple of hours. And so I say that from personal experience. One of the first places that we visited in that program was a building designed by a couple of Chicago architects who hired a young draftsman named Frank Lloyd Wright to design the lobby. By the time I saw it as an 8-year-old boy in 1971, the lobby was a wreck. It had the building had fallen into disrepair. The glass canopy over the core of the building was now covered with black paint and lead to protect it from the rain, so there wasn't light coming in. Paint was peeling everywhere. It was a disaster. But there was a photograph of what the lobby originally looked like. And that photograph, coupled with what I could see in the building and my imagination, inspired me to just start looking at buildings and looking at the world differently. I saw light, I saw balance, and I became obsessed with Frank Lloyd Wright. My project going home that day was to build a model of the building, and my teacher was the first of many, many people who said, "You have no drawing talent and you should not consider a career in architecture." They were right. So it took a while to figure out how I could make a living at this Frank Lloyd Wright thing, and I've been doing that for the last 18 months. Instead, I chose a career in engineering, practiced as an engineering intern, didn't like it very much, and did what every other person in the 1980s who had an undergraduate degree that they weren't going to use did. I went to law school. You could always make a living as a lawyer, right? So I went to law school. With the engineering background, intellectual property, patent law seemed to be a very good fit. And what I did, first in private practice, later as corporate counsel, what I did was to focus on innovation, on creativity, on advertising and marketing and branding as the focus of my career. I got to work with incredibly creative individuals, ranging from solo inventors to Nobel Prize winners. It was a fabulous career, and I was on my way to becoming corporate general counsel of a multinational now known as Newell Brands. And I said, corporate governance will kill me. I have no passion for that. I will slit my wrists. I'd rather die than have to do that. So the CEO asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, give me a couple of businesses to run. You know, I don't like armchair quarterbacking, and as general counsel, that's what you do. You armchair quarterback, right? You're always telling any lawyers in the room? A couple. Okay, so with no disrespect to the lawyers in the room, you know, you're second guessing what other people's decisions, right? Oh, you shouldn't have done that, or maybe we're going to counsel you not to do this. That's not my style. I put my money where my mouth is. So what I did instead was to say, give me a couple of businesses to run. We had these two companies, Parker Pens and Waterman Pens. Again, for the young people, there was this thing called a pen that you would use. And sometimes you had really, really fancy, expensive ones, and that's what these brands were. But because pens were going away, these businesses were dying. I had a great passion for writing instruments, so I took over these businesses as their leader, global leader, and turned them around. Decided in the middle of the financial crisis that I didn't need a job, so I fired myself from the company to save the career of a couple of young marketers who would have lost their jobs if I didn't leave. I could take care of myself, and a few months later, a friend of mine at Valspar Company, the paint company, called me up and said, hey, we would like it if you would run this business that we have called Guardsman. It's a mix of furniture care products and furniture protection plans, which are like insurance, and it's global, and would be right up your alley. So I ran that for 7 years, and then I got to a place where I said, okay, I've paid for mom's retirement, I have paid for my in-laws' retirement, and I've even put some money aside for my retirement with my spouse. It's time to go do something good in the world. I've been working on nonprofit boards for 30 years. If you're in the business world, I encourage you strongly to pick up some nonprofit interests. It really takes care of your soul in the way that your business might take care of your wallet. And I was chatting about this with a friend who said, you know, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, one of my clients, she's our IP lawyer, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation is looking for a CEO. And on Lynn's first day of work, Lynn being the friend, on Lynn's first day of work at the Schiff Harden Law Firm, she was my mentee, and I took her out to lunch, and then I gave her a walking tour of Chicago architecture, because I'd been a docent for the Architecture Foundation. And she said, I know you love architecture. One of my clients, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, is looking for a CEO, and you'd be fabulous at it. Put a resume together, got the board to lower its standards, and here I am. It made sense because we have a strong brand licensing program. We have to differentiate ourselves as a brand because there are 70+ Frank Lloyd Wright organizations around the country. So how do we make ours stand out and be special? We needed somebody who had an understanding of brand strategy. We are also are financially very dependent on generosity. We didn't have a good financial strategy for stable financing of all the projects that we undertake. And having led a few turnarounds in business, they thought I could do the job. So that's how I get to where I am. As Steve and I have talked about this journey, first in Scottsdale a year ago and then this morning, you know, the thing that comes through very clear is that you get the greatest satisfaction in life. And I loved all the careers that I've had. But this is the best job I've ever had because I make a living taking something I've been passionate about now for 46 years, and my job is to inspire that passion in other people. So hopefully I'll have a chance to inspire some of that passion in you today. It's a great way to make a living, and I recommend it. But enough about me. Let's talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, whose 150th birthday we are celebrating. He's born in 1867. We'll see if all these animations work. He's born in 1867, 2 years after the Civil War. So think about that. This is a man whose architecture we still find relevant and even modern today, but he's born just after the Civil War to a family in Wisconsin that had come here from Wales. They're known in the area as the God Almighty Lloyd Joneses. The area of Wisconsin, there are a bunch of Unitarian ministers in the family. The area of Wisconsin is known as And I don't know if you can see that picture very well, but it's unglaciated, so it's not the flat Midwest that you know. It's actually got a tremendous amount of terrain in western Wisconsin. And that landscape comes to inspire Wright. And he's educated by his aunts, who formed one of the first kindergartens in America, in something known as the Froebel blocks, these simple geometric shapes that would become the source of inspiration for Frank Lloyd Wright's entire career. Just simple geometry, squares and spheres and cubes, rectangles and triangles and parallelograms underlie every bit of his work. Everything is designed on a simple geometric plan. His love of nature, as I mentioned, is inspired by the landscape, and that's a view of the Wisconsin River right outside of Taliesin, his home in Wisconsin. That quote up there is from him. Nature is, beyond geometry, nature is the other source of inspiration for all of Wright's work. And as he said, study nature, love nature, stay close to nature. It will never fail you. Those are lessons that we could be paying attention to today as we look at a more fragile world around us, and how we build and design in that fragile world. He has less than he actually doesn't finish high school, and he matriculates at the University of Wisconsin. He has less than 1 year of engineering school before he leaves. He's eventually given a Doctor of Fine Arts from the university. They are just erecting this year a plaque as an honored alumni, and I said it should be an honored honorary alumni because he had not much use for college and formal education. He believed you learn more working with your hands and doing things rather than sitting in a classroom. And so he leaves Madison, Wisconsin. He goes down to Chicago. He takes up with someone that his uncle had introduced him to a couple of years earlier, an architect named Joseph Silsby. Wright's first built work is a small chapel on the property at Taliesin in the Lloyd Jones Valley that Silsby designed. Silsby usually designs these big piles, houses and office buildings, but he designs this simple chapel because as a member of the Unitarian Church, a friend of the Lloyd Jones family, he feels the need to do this as a favor, and he takes young Frank in to do the draftsmanship. Frank goes to work for him in Chicago, and less than a year later, the world begins to change. In Chicago, he takes up with Louis Sullivan, the great pioneer of modern architecture. That's his picture up on the screen. Sullivan is famous for the line, form follows function. You design the structure of a building and then you add adornment to it. He and the other architects of Chicago designed the buildings of the World's Columbian Exhibition, and that's sort of the background on the slide there. And it's at the World's Columbian Exhibition that Wright encounters Asian art. So here's a little factoid for you. Wright makes more money over the course of his life buying and selling Asian art than he does as an architect. He is the largest trader of Asian art, at least in the United States, possibly in the Western world during his lifespan. And Asian art inspires everything that he does. It teaches him how to construct images, landscapes, views. Along with Sullivan, teaching him about modern architecture and modern materials, because this is a time when steel frames are used to build skyscrapers, when terracotta is being used as the adornment of buildings because you don't need masonry, you don't need brick and stone to construct a building anymore. Sullivan teaches him all these things, and Wright starts to go off on his own and do his own work. Well, Sullivan wasn't pleased with that, so Sullivan fires him. And the other architects of Chicago, including perhaps the most famous and important architect in Chicago, if not America at the time, Daniel Burnham, says, Mr. Wright, you're a talented young man, and we want to encourage your talent. So what we're going to do is this. We're going to pay for you to go study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris for a couple of years, because that's what great architects do. And then we're going to pay for you to go spend a couple of years in Italy at the American Academy in Rome. So you learn from classic Roman architecture, you learn Palladio and all of the other greats of the classic world. And then when you come back, we will make you a partner in America's leading architecture firm. To which Frank Lloyd Wright said, no, thank you. Wright wanted to create an American architecture, and he wanted to create his own voice, and he had no use for replicating the architecture of the classical world, for bringing Europe further into the United States. He felt that our young democracy needed its own architecture to represent its own values. Wright also felt like that architecture from Europe didn't do very much for understanding the American landscape. It had no place in it. Remember, he's born in 1867. He's rooted in what is called transcendentalism. This is the literature of Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau, about living in this American landscape at one with the natural world, that's the opportunity for us in this virgin territory, that we should do better than Europe did. And so this becomes the source of his American architecture. I'll just say as a personal point that we get very impressed with Wright's buildings, but Wright's values around America are something that are very powerful to me. I feel we don't do enough in this country to celebrate his fundamental Americanness. He was one of the first people to really put American culture on a world stage, and that's something that sometimes gets forgotten. 1893, therefore, he opens his own studio in Oak Park. This is the studio, Marjorie, that you and your colleagues visited in Oak Park, Illinois. He hires Marion Mahoney, one of the first women to be licensed as an architect in America. She is his first employee. That's her picture on the right. In fact, a third of the women in Wright's studio a third of the people in Wright's studio over the course of his career were women. He hired people of every race, ethnicity. He didn't care about gender at a time when the word sexual orientation wasn't even coined. He didn't care about that. He cared about what you can do, because one of the American values that he felt very strongly about was meritocracy. If you could do the work and you could do the work well, that's all that mattered, nothing else. These are what came to be known as the Prairie School years, and you see a couple of the buildings there, the Darwin Martin House on the lower right, the Roby House on the lower left, exemplified by strong horizontal lines, overhanging eaves, the flatness of the prairie communicated in 3 dimensions. He builds a national reputation out of this, and he has commissions coming from all over the country. And he begins to articulate 2 important principles. He disagreed with his mentor, Louis Sullivan, by saying, form and function are one thing. They have to be fully integrated. And he also came to believe that architecture was not defined by design and structure, but rather that architecture was about the space within the structure and the lives that would be led within those buildings that he designed. That was the nature of architecture itself. It was the purpose and the lives that would be served by the building. In 1909, there's a scandal. He leaves with that woman that you see on the right, May Mancini, the wife of one of his clients. He leaves with her to Europe, takes her as a mistress. They go to Europe in order to publish what is known as the Wasmuth Portfolio. It's the first international publication of Wright's work in 1911. He can't return to Oak Park, a small suburban community outside of Chicago. The scandal is too great. He is not divorced, she is not divorced, and they're living in sin. Instead, he returns to his home territory in Wisconsin, and he builds a house called Taliesin. Taliesin is the shining brow in Welsh. It's actually the name of a medieval Welsh poet, but for Wright it also symbolized something else. That is, he was building in that unglaciated landscape. One would not build at the top of the hill. The top of the hill was nature's territory. Nature had created that crowning achievement, if you will, and at best human beings should build at the brow level of the hill. So if you think of your head as the hill, he's building down here. And his building, Taliesin, actually wraps itself around and embraces the hill and embraces this driftless area landscape. Some people have called Taliesin an autobiography in wood and stone, because you see the fields where he worked as a kid, as a boy, where he said he added tired to tired working on his uncle's farm. You see the material coming directly from the surrounding area. The wood, the stone is all right there. And he creates what seems to be a happy life there. But one day while he's in Chicago, working on a building, he gets a phone call. There's been a fire at Taliesin. A servant named Julian Carleton, for reasons still unknown to this day, has locked people in the building, set it on fire, and as they tried to escape, he bludgeoned them with a hatchet. May Mancini, 2 of her children, not by Wright, but by their father, Edwin Cheney, and a number of workers were killed that day. Wright returns with Mr. Cheney on the same train to Taliesin to claim the bodies, and he starts to rebuild. This marked the end of the Prairie School years. He rebuilt Taliesin in a different style, and he began a long phase of experimentation. We often get asked at the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation about mistresses, murders, and leaky roofs, as I said. The mistresses are a sign of Wright's unconventional thinking, whatever we may think morally as to whether we approve or don't approve of that. This is a man who felt bound by no convention in life or in architecture, and at least on the architecture side, that's why he achieved what he achieved. The murders, as I mentioned, mark the closing of a passage in his life. We don't know if he would have gone on to do the work he did, or would he have been trapped continuing in the Prairie style for the rest of his life. So a hard way to close a chapter, to be sure, but definitely a reason to close a chapter. And the leaky roofs, well, they're just a sign of an experimental architect, an experimental life. He found people over the course of his career who'd be willing to take these risks with him, and some of them wound up with leaky roofs. Herbert Johnson of S.C. Johnson, when he called Frank to complain about the roof leaking on his head in the middle of a dinner party, was told by Mr. Wright, Hib, move the goddamn chair. Don't fix the roof. So he begins this period of experimentation. He goes to Japan and builds the Imperial Hotel, which you see on the right. The Imperial Hotel is one of very few structures to survive the 1923 earthquake that leveled most of Tokyo. So bear in mind, the roofs leak, but the structure stayed up through a major earthquake. And he began to experiment with new building methods. What you see on the right there are the Storer House, the Ennis House, both in Los Angeles and the Arizona Biltmore in Phoenix, Arizona, which were constructed in a style called textile block architecture. This was meant to lower the cost of buildings and increase the flexibility of building material so that it could be easily constructed and yet embellished with appropriate adornment in a very simple and repetitive manner. These buildings leak. These buildings have lots of problems because they are experimental buildings. The Ennis House, the one on the lower left there, is owned by a billionaire who is worried that he's not going to be a billionaire by the time he's finished owning the Ennis House because there's so much work to be done. In the 30s, the Depression hits and there's not a lot of work to do. So he is married to his third wife, Olga Vanna Wright, and he begins an apprenticeship program. Young men and women from around the country and a couple from overseas will pay him a few $100s, and they get to live and work at Taliesin. When there is work, that work will be shared, and these young people will learn by doing. Otherwise, they're farming, they're working on the buildings, they're doing whatever needs to be done around the estate. It's sort of a precursor to the modern-day kibbutz in Israel. It's a bit of a socialist collective in a sense, and that they're all pooling their interests and getting together and pooling their money to survive the lean years. But they weren't completely lean. One of the houses you see here you surely recognize, and that's Falling Water, built in 38, started in 36. Edgar Kaufman out in Pittsburgh has his son, Edgar Jr., as one of the apprentices. And Edgar convinces his father to take a chance on Mr. Wright to build their country home in Bear Run, Pennsylvania, and what a home it was. To set the context for that home, something else that was happening in the Depression was the emergence on the American scene of the international style of architecture. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, all these German and Dutch emigres coming to the U.S., beginning their work here, bringing their style here. Another architect named Philip Johnson holds an exhibition of their work at the Museum of Modern Art in the early 30s and doesn't include Wright, saying Wright is the greatest architect of the 19th century, and international style is where we're heading. Well, Falling Water is an international style building. It is Wright's only international style building, and it is regarded worldwide as the most important house ever built by the members of the American Institute of Architects, who looked at this earlier this year. So if you're going to try to play a game of one-upsmanship with Frank Lloyd Wright, he's going to win. He's going to design a Falling Water. The house on the left is the first, it's not the first, it's an example of what is known as a Usonian house. Usonia United States of North America. I guess USONA didn't have the same ring to it. But these were houses that were designed for people of modest means with whom Wright was concerned over his whole career. Simple, single level for the most part. This one happens to be a 2-level house that could be afforded by ordinary working people. The first one was built up in Madison, Wisconsin. It's known as the Jacobs House. And there were over 300 Usonian houses built. And we'll talk more about those in a moment. In 1939, the 72-year-old Mr. Wright is suffering from pneumonia. His doctors say, we need you to get out of Wisconsin in any event. And he goes out to a place that he was fond of, to Arizona, and he builds Taliesin West. That's the image on the upper right of the drafting studio there. Pardon me. He's inspired by the creative geometry of the desert. It's raw, it's brutal. It is as masculine and hard as the rolling hills of western Wisconsin were feminine and round. And this inspires this whole new outburst. Oh, thank you. I've got one, thanks. And so he begins to design, over the last 20 years of his life, more buildings than he designed in the first 72 years of his life. These include Florida Southern College, which I had the pleasure of visiting in Lakeland about a month ago, Price Tower, his only skyscraper, which you see here, the Marin County Civic Center, or some people know it as the Set for Gattaca, because even now it still looks like it's something from the future. A fundamentally radical design in theater in Dallas called the Kalita Humphreys, the Guggenheim, of course, the Guggenheim Museum, which you also see on the screen, and Usonian automatic houses. These are like the Usonian houses, these simple designs for working class people, but these could be constructed as kits, and so they were very, very simple to build. The career of Frank Lloyd Wright can be summed up in a few things, and this is where we start to get the brand of America's greatest architect. There we go. 70 years of bold experimentation. The man never looks backwards, once. Pioneering use of open floor plans. Remember, those of a certain age will remember when the open floor plan became all the rage in offices? Well, it wasn't new. It was old. It was really old. You're going to see the first one. New materials, new lighting systems, heating, cooling, structural innovations. A man whose work is unlike any other American architect of his time. He builds in 36 states, 3 countries, but he has an influence globally. He designs over 1,100 structures. 500 of them were actually built, 440 of them remain in existence, and 73 of them are open to the public. And then coming back to this theme that I hope you're getting as important to me in the foundation, a man who's constantly teaching us about the inspiration of nature, how we can work with nature, and the inspiration and how we express through architecture our fundamental American values. I am so proud to be the person who's the standard bearer of this legacy, because he inspired me in so many ways. And I just feel like as we look at his 150th birthday next week, a week from today, that we have much to be proud of as a nation that produced this genius. So those are elements of his brand, but he had a few other elements. As I said, he wanted to live an unconventional life. And in the course of doing so, he created this uniquely American architecture, always seeking excellence. Excellence, excellence, excellence. He hated mediocrity, couldn't stand it, had no use for it. He felt no constraint of history, and yet he was deeply aware of it, you would even say rooted in it, because history would be the source for inspiration rather than a constraint, as so many architects and designers of his time felt it was, that we had to embrace classical columns and classical temples. No, we had to create our own in Frank Lloyd Wright's world. A career marked by limitless innovation. No building went without some type of new feature in it over the course of his career. And to say, connected to nature, but also deeply connected to people. If you were to ask a child today, and if you have a child in your life, go home and do this. How do you draw a house? It's a box and it has a triangle on top, right? Isn't that the way we all learned to draw houses? And that's the way houses were being built. Boxes with triangles on top. And inside those boxes, by the way, what did you have? Lots of little boxes, rooms. Wright broke these boxes. He changed the shape of architecture. He opened up the floor plans from inside to outside. So as you can see in the photo, you could start seeing through entire houses. No more looking through little tiny windows in the walls to get a little glimpse of nature. Windows were primarily designed to keep nature out. Wright instead wanted us to be looking outside. I think he would not have been entirely happy that we spent so much time looking at his buildings when so much of his work was designed for you to look from. Even in this room, we see that influence as we look outside from the architecture. That's what modernism was about. He designed to the human scale. The lives of people would be important. And so everything had to factor in our humanity. And he called all of this synthesis of inside and outside, nature and built, architecture and people's lives. This natural synthesis would be called organic architecture. He exposed us through a lot of effort. He published house plans. This one that's on the screen is from the Ladies' Home Journal. He's built models and sent them around the country in exhibits. Broadacre City was his answer to urbanism and the crowded cities that he was seeing rising up. He gave lectures. He published papers and books. One way to pay for things in the Depression, he wrote and published an autobiography. He courted the leading influences of their time, and he wasn't so interested in the trade press. Yes, he talked to architecture magazines and newspapers, but he was more interested in talking to House Beautiful because he wanted to talk to people. If people embraced his ideas, if people got to know them, that would change American building and architecture and in turn change the world. So House Beautiful publishes a retrospective of his career, mid-career. Exhibits all over the country that he would organize himself, shameless self-promoter, Frank Lloyd Wright. But the exhibits were so important that there's actually a book that's just been published, that's what's up on the screen, about his exhibits. With the plans for Falling Water being seen, and you can see it in the background there, the success of that building, Time magazine puts him on the cover, and he becomes friends with Henry and Claire Booth Luce. We have some artwork created by Claire Booth Luce while they were living at Taliesin West up in the living room. But they recognize this man's unique achievements. And he does something, again, sort of unheard of. Yes, there's plaques and there's cornerstones, but he would actually sign his buildings with these small Cherokee red tiles and his initials bearing his signature, because he wanted people to know that it was unmistakably his work, his idea. He has a commercial plan. He creates kid houses. So there were these Sears Roebuck houses going back into the 19th century that were these bland, banal houses, often working men's cottages. He thought we could do better, so he creates a system of kid houses called the American System-Built Houses. The Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation archive has more drawings associated with these buildings because there were over 30 designs. And they all had to be something that could be executed by ordinary people, ordinary owners in the field. No professional contractors. Sorry to those people in the construction trade here. He was trying to get people to be able to do this on their own. So lots of detailed drawings. The thing that caused the failure of this system, which started in 1915, was the need for the material that was being used in these kits for World War I. Otherwise, we'd probably see a lot more of these houses. And these plans were very simple. They were being advertised in newspapers. And a simple working man's cottage, well, it could look like that. That's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on a block of several of these system-built houses called the Burnham blocks. So he would elevate design and bring into the working man's life some beauty, some high levels of craftsmanship that weren't being offered to those people in his time. He also personified the brand. He tried to live this organic life, responding to nature. He liked to talk about these American values and promoted them everywhere. Of course, his architecture was well known, but so was his style, the pork pie hat, the cane, the cape, or the scarf everywhere. He didn't need the cane to walk, by the way. That was to be able to make a dramatic gesture at somebody. He'd point the cane. He had this manner of speaking and writing that just captivated people. He could hold their attention. He was eminently quotable, very, very quotable, often with controversy. In one of those quotes, he talks about how when people would call him arrogant, he'd said, I've done something in this life. I would prefer to have an honest arrogance than a false modesty. If you've done something in the world, you shouldn't be ashamed to talk about it. You should be telling people about it. And he certainly was an avid individualist. He also licensed his brand. Again, not something that people in his time did, but paints, fabrics, wallpaper, rugs, china, silver, crystal, all these things, furniture came out from leading companies like Henriton and Schumacher, Martin Senor Paints. I'm really happy that one of the things we did this year is we started a new licensing partnership with Schumacher. It had gone away about 30 years ago, and we brought them back in, and that was just launched last month. So his first licensee became his most recent licensee again. But all as a way to bring his design sensibility into people's homes. That was what he was aiming for. I'm going to rush through the next couple of slides because I realize this is going slower than I planned. So let's talk about business. He worked for businessmen, unspoiled men of business with instincts and ideals. That's what he wanted to attract. He brought leading industrialists into his work, and he built buildings for them. The Larkin Building in Buffalo, New York, was the first modern office building of his design. You see this imposing brick edifice that was designed to keep the industrial environment in which it was built outside, the smoke, the noise, everything else. Inside it would be something different. So let's talk about the brand values of the building, of the company rather. They were all about making the lives of the women of the house easier and better. They made soap. They had a diverse catalog as big as the Sears catalog. They employed associates like Avon does to go to people's homes. They had the parties before Tupperware had their parties. And they produced magazines to develop this interest in the Larkin look. Larkin, however, had an idea for his business. He said, "I wish to unite the interests of employer and employee, making all work more pleasant and better paid." So what did he do? He built a building with Frank Lloyd Wright to embody that idea. The building, as I said, with this imposing brick edifice, would communicate values. To the world, it reflected global ambitions. He had 4 globes on the outside of the building. To the worker, he told them they were important. Honest labor needs no master, and simple justice needs no slaves. That's what you walked past every day on your way into the building. And once you got inside, no more brick imposing structure. Instead, you had transparency, space, light, and air. Sometimes people gasp when they see how different the building was on the inside versus the outside. Workers and management could see each other instead of being shielded from each other. And everything was about cleanliness, the white interior, the lightness, that ability to just have air, free-flowing air and space. Leadership and design combined to create a shared set of values among employees, managers, customers, and executives. Innovation, a fundamental value of the Larkin Company, was built into the building. It was fireproof. It used new material called magnesite that not only made it fireproof, but also added soundproofing in this open floor plan. It had some of the earliest air conditioning in the United States. The toilets were hung from the walls for the first time rather than being built onto the floor, so they could be cleaned, the rooms could be cleaned more easily. An open floor plan, a pneumatic vacuum cleaning system that had not been deployed before, adjustable desks and chairs. Anybody here work on a standing desk? Okay, that's not new. This is where it got started, this notion of a repositionable desk. Electric intercoms and purified drinking water were all innovations that Wright brought into the building to reflect the company's values and their brand. In the Larkin building, Wright achieved the full integration of a building, its surrounding environment by having this difference between the exterior and the interior, the company's management, and its workers. And he did it all with a single design that brought all of these things together. The architecture itself, Mr. Larkin would say, represented the brand of Larkin. Today, we work in anonymous office buildings, right? We throw a brand on the outside, and that's how we brand a building. But this was the building as a brand itself. and it was a remarkable achievement. Sadly, the Depression got the best of this company. In 1942, it was liquidated, and that rather bad photograph that you see on the right, that's all that remains of the Larkin building, which was demolished in 1950. Those of us who are architectural enthusiasts mourn its passing. I go to Buffalo and I pay a little tribute to that little pier that remains. Wright did it again, by the way, in the 30s. The S.C. Johnson Administration Building, and then at the end of the war, the Research Tower, 1944. So let's talk about this as well. S.C. Johnson is a family company. It's referred to itself that way for nearly a century. Several core values. A progressive company, had one of the first pension plans for its employees, which it developed to get people through the Depression. It established a community fund, which is a precursor to the United Way. Sam Johnson, the founder, said, "The goodwill of people is the only enduring thing in any business." So this notion of respect for employees and for customers was critical. A company built around innovation, self-expression, and entrepreneurship were early values and continuing values of the company. And risk-taking. This is a company that sent out 28,000 cases of glow coat wax to its customers in the middle of the Depression and said, "Pay us when you can. We know money is tight." They took a lot of risks. Johnson, needing a new building for his growing company, wanted the best architect in America because he wanted the best building in America. And what did he get? Well, let's talk about it. He got a place where work is important. Again, workers and management connected visibly through an open floor plan. An environment where interaction between employees could be spontaneous and direct. You didn't have to go through departments. You were just all right there. And he wanted an enduring symbol of the company's creative and adventurous spirit. How'd you like to walk into that reception area every day? Wright, inspired by nature, looks at a staghorn cholla cactus, a bit of a weed plant in the desert, and looks at its skeleton, the simple mesh. And he sees strength there because the slender stalk is going to support all this weight on top of this cactus. You can see that on the left. He embodies that by designing pillars with a stem, a calyx, and a petal like a plant. From this, he would see strength. That mesh structure, when incorporated, would allow him to achieve something extraordinary. The people that were responsible for enforcing the building code weren't going to let him build this building because they said the pillars won't support the roof. So he builds a pillar, and he achieves what they are supposed to achieve, 6 tons of weight being supported on the pillar. Then he starts adding more weight. When they get to 18 times the weight, 60 plus tons, they run out of space to put material on top of this pillar, but the pillar is not cracked yet. This is strength inspired from nature. Wright understood what he was doing. And so they start to build this building, a forest of columns that would support a glass sky. Or as Wright said, it was designed to be as inspiring a place to work in as any cathedral ever was to worship in. So that's the roof made of Pyrex tubing on top of those pillars. And that's the workspace of the administration building. Still as breathtaking today. I was there 2 weeks ago. Still as breathtaking today as it was in its time. This is a contemporary photograph. There's computers in there. The research tower, equally inventive. The central supporting core with all of these floors cantilevered from the outside. He wanted you to be able to see the structure because the structure itself would be the decoration. And you can see it. You can see it during the day, and you can really see it at night. There's nothing like it. And so what you have is a brand, again, becoming a building, a streamlined design for a hopeful future in the midst of the Depression, a symbol of renewal for a community that saw so many businesses close in the Depression, this open floor plan communicating respect for workers, innovation in every detail of the building, and risk-taking. 40% of the company's net worth went into the buildings in the middle of the Depression. A little crazy. All kinds of innovations, and in the interest of time, I won't go through them, but these innovations inspired innovation. The first 10 years that the research tower was open, RAID, GLADE, OFF, and PLEDGE were created in that research tower. Fisk Johnson, the current chairman, 2 weeks ago said, "These buildings continue to inspire us to think differently and to work differently." And so what Wright does with his commercial work is to create an architecture sympathetic to the relationships around which business is built. Relationships with workers, relationships with communities, and relationships with customers. Buildings that would inspire the company's values. Today, we still use buildings to communicate things. The Apple headquarters, this big round building designed by Norman Foster, is designed to be iconic, not only to represent Apple, but also its values. Every inch of that building, including that central core, is designed to create casual spaces for interaction so that people will meet people in other departments regularly and not just be constrained into their own area. That's what Steve Jobs believed would make his company great. You also see some buildings that don't do that. This is my favorite example of bad architecture, the CCTV building in Beijing. It's this huge structure, and what does it communicate to you? Because it's so out of scale, bears no relationship to anything around it. To me, it communicates dominance and power, and maybe that's what China Central TV is supposed to be communicating, but I don't particularly care for that if that's what it's communicating. I like buildings that have that more organic feel. Cities do this as well. 4 distinct skylines here. London with its walkie-talkie and its gherkin, the Burj Al Arab and the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, the Pudong skyline of Shanghai, and the open skyline of Chicago. What are these communities, what are these cities communicating about their values through the architecture that's built in their environment? Because you do communicate something about that. I understand some of you have been up to Nashville recently because Tallahassee is looking at how it brands itself and how it uses art and architecture for that. Just one bit of advice. The AT&T building, also known as the Batman building in Nashville, don't do it. Considered one of the ugliest buildings in America. I hope its architect isn't here, but just don't do it. You can communicate something about values that you don't really necessarily want to inspire. So, what we want to do, and this is what the work of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation is we want people to look at these principles. Nature is offering us many gifts, and we should be paying attention to them. Observe nature, and then act with intention to bring nature into your environment in some way, whether you bring it in structure or by capturing views and borrowing the landscape as part of your architecture. That's what Frank Lloyd Wright is telling us to do. Build buildings that bless the landscape and be of the environment and not merely on the environment or in the environment. Become an organic part of that world around you. Pay attention to the human scale and the lives that are being led in the buildings and enhance these organic relationships. The relationships of building to land, the relationship of buildings to the people who are going to be housed and working in them. The relationship of the building to the purpose for which it's being built. And then, really importantly, the relationships of people to people, because that's, at the end of the day, what the building should be serving, is how we interact with each other. And if the building is stopping us from doing that the way we like, then we have no use for that building. Frank Lloyd Wright said, "The longer I live, the more beautiful life becomes. If you foolishly ignore beauty, you'll find yourself soon without it. Your life will be impoverished. But if you invest in beauty, it will remain with you for all the days of your life." So thank you, Economic Club. I've got an image here of Florida Southern.
Thank you so much. We could have spent the afternoon. This is fascinating. Thank you. We'll have time for 2 questions if someone would like to come up to the microphone. Just one, Larry. Only one question.
Apparently she knows you, Larry.
Real simple question. Will the world ever see another Frank Lloyd Wright?
I hope not, mostly because Wright would have hated that. He hated when his students, his apprentices, would try to create buildings that look like his. He was all about people finding their own authentic voices. That was what was so critical. And so certainly we want people to be inspired by his ideas and his architecture and to embody those ideas in their building. But we want people to find their own voices. Even at the School of Architecture that we house at the foundation, That's what we tell people. Find your own authentic voice and go out and do good in the world with it. The little kids that come up for our ed programs, that's what we say to them. Even if they hate architecture, they hate Frank Lloyd Wright, but they find their own voices, we win the day when those kids find their voices and use them to make a difference in the world. So that's what we're about. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. How you doing? First of all, I want to say thank you for coming, telling us about White, his history, and his journey through
My pleasure.
and everything. I'm Howard Milligan, a representative of Florida A&M University.
Go Rattlers.
A little bit more about the essence of Wright. I believe that with art, it's something that you're taking your being, you're putting it into a tangible asset, whether it's through photography or filmmaking, like I do, but through buildings like Mr. Wright did. How do you have any suggestions for how we connect other people to their being, so that way we can bring in this more beautiful world that I believe Wright envisioned through his architecture, how other artists bring that into their world and everything. Like, my question is, how do us as human beings go about getting connected to the essences in our souls and becoming greater artists and pushing the world forward through beauty like Wright did?
Well, it's a great question, and I wish I really had an answer to that. But here's what I guess I think. And remember, I'm not an artist. I'm not an architect. But I'm married to an artist. I've spent a lot of my life with artists. Here's what I think. And I think this is not just true for artists. I think it's for everybody. There's a feeling that you get when you do certain things, when you see certain things, when you have certain experiences, that you just, there's no word for it. It's passion. You feel differently. You come to life in a different way. And I think when you communicate that out to others, it's infectious. And I think that's at the root of all art. Hopefully that's at the root of many, if not most, human pursuits. That's why I say, for Frank Lloyd Wright, it was all about this notion of authenticity, finding his voice. If he had chosen the easy path, which is to go off to Europe, follow the conventional life, we wouldn't have had the innovation. Maybe someone else would have come up with it, maybe not. We won't know that. But because he chose the thing that inspired him, which was this relationship to nature, and he looked around and saw all the gifts that nature was offering and used them as the source of inspiration, that's what enabled him to find his voice. So figure out what inspires your voice, what drives your passion, and then use that in every single thing that you do. And as I say, it just becomes infectious. I honestly believe the whole universe conspires at that point to help you achieve what you're trying to achieve. So I hope I think you're a student representative here. Well, as you finish up your career, do that. Use that to inspire your passion, and I have no doubt you'll be successful.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, and Mr. Graff will be here for those of you who have an additional question. And we'll be presenting you with a limited edition of an eagle that has been sculpted by our local and nationally recognized sculptor, Stanley Proctor.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much.
Sorry to have gone on a little longer than I expected.
Oh, wonderful. We are adjourned.
You've been listening to a delayed broadcast of the June 1st, 2017 luncheon meeting of the Economic Club of Florida, featuring Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation President and CEO Stuart Graff. This program was recorded at the Florida State University Alumni Center in Tallahassee. Join us again next time for another economic